before the first word of the fellowship is spoken, before Frodo even knows the word Mordor, before 9 companions take a single step together into the cold night outside Rivendell, the story is already over. Not finished. Over. As in, the outcome was already decided by a man who spent 2,000 years making sure that when the moment came, the right people would be standing in the right places, carrying the right things in their hearts. That man wore a gray cloak. He carried a battered staff. He smelled of pipe smoke. He made fireworks for children. His name was Gandalf. And almost nothing you remember about him is actually the most important thing about him. Picture the Grey Havens not as you last saw them. Golden, departing, full of goodbyes, but ancient, cold, salt-eaten. The year is 1000 of the Third Age, and a ship is coming in from the west carrying 5 old men who are not old men. The first off the gangplank comes with the energy of someone who has never once doubted he deserved to be first. White robes, dark hair, a voice built for command. Everyone on the dock responds to him the way iron filings respond to a magnet. His name will become Saruman. Remember that for later. 2 others step off together, already turning east, already hearing something no one else can hear. They will walk toward that sound and never come back. The world will wonder about them forever. A 4th comes slowly, stops to watch a seagull that has landed on the prow, forgets where he is for a moment. Brown-robed, gentle, in no hurry. The world of birds and roots and growing things calls to him more urgently than whatever waits inland. And then, last of all, the 5th. He is smaller than the white one. He looks older, not in the way of years accumulated but in the way of years felt, every one of them. His cloak and his staff and his hair are all the same shade of gray, as if he and the morning fog reached some private agreement about color. He comes down the gangplank with the unhurried attention of someone who finds the cold salt air and the carved stones and the watching elves genuinely, specifically interesting. Not performing curiosity, actually curious. Certain the shipwright watches him come. Certain has been standing on shores since before the sun existed. He has seen the stars appear, watched a world drown and be remade, outlasted entire ages. His sight goes so deep that it bypasses the surface of things entirely and reads what's underneath. He looks at this gray, last off the ship, apparently least figure, and he inclines his head. Not at the white one, not at any of the others. This one. He calls him master. He takes a ring from his own hand, Narya, one of the 3 elven rings untouched by Sauron, set with a red stone like a held coal, and he offers it to the Grey Pilgrim. The gift of this ring, he explains, is the power to rekindle hearts in a world growing cold. Then he says something that most tellings skip over, because it sits quietly in the middle of a longer passage and doesn't announce itself. He says, "For your labors will be heavy." He sees it, right there on the dock. In the first minutes, the Grey Pilgrim has arrived in Middle-earth to do something that will cost everything, in a body that will feel every bit of it. The Grey Pilgrim takes the ring. He turns the stone inward, toward his palm, where it won't be seen. He will wear it hidden for nearly 2,000 years. His working name is Gandalf. His true name, the name he has carried since before the world was shaped, is Olorin. To understand why he is here at all, you have to go much further back than the Third Age. In the gardens of Valinor, long before the sun was made, there lived a spirit named Olorin. One line in the Valaquenta describes him, and it is worth holding. Wisest of the Mayor was Olorin. Not most powerful, not most magnificent, not most terrible. Wisest. That single word is the entire key. He lived in the gardens of Irmo, the Lord of Visions, a name whose root means something closer to clear inner sight than to dreaming in any loose human sense. The full and perfect image of a thing held in the mind. He was a seer of what things truly were beneath their surfaces. But what matters most is not where he lived. It is where he kept going. His ways took him often to the house of Nienna. Nienna, the Lady of Mercy, the one Vala whose halls sat at the very edge of creation, with windows that looked outward into the void. Her entire existence was grief. Not self-pity, not despair, but the grief of someone who looked honestly at every wound the world had ever suffered and refused to look away. She wept, but not for herself. She wept for others. And from that weeping her students learned two things: pity and endurance in hope. Olorin was her most faithful student. He didn't just pass through. He came back, again and again, and sat with a grief that was not his and chose to understand it anyway. There is one more detail about Olorin in Valinor that changes everything. He walked among the elves unseen, and they did not know whence came the fair visions or the promptings of wisdom that he put in their hearts. They never knew he was there. They felt sudden courage and thought it was their own. They woke from despair and assumed they had simply slept well. He gave gifts that arrived without a giver's name attached. He did not want credit. He wanted results. He was content to be invisible, content to kindle a flame and vanish before anyone thought to ask where the warmth came from. This quality, the willingness to work through people rather than instead of them, was why Manwë chose him for Middle-earth. And it was why, when the choice was offered, Olorin was the only one who said he didn't want it. Around the year 1000 of the Third Age, the Vala held a council. Sauron was not destroyed. He was diminished, broken, hiding somewhere in the east, but not gone, not finished. The Vala couldn't send their full power into Middle-earth. The last time they tried that, entire continents sank. The world could not survive another war of wrath. So emissaries, 5 of them, old men's bodies, human limitations, an explicit instruction to work by inspiration and persuasion, never domination. They could not do the job themselves. They had to teach others to do it. 2 stepped forward immediately. Saruman, with the confidence of someone who had never seriously entertained the possibility. He wasn't the most qualified person in any room he entered. And Alatar, sent by Orom the hunter. 2 more joined as companions. Awendil Radagast, who loved birds and growing things, and Palando, Alatar's friend. That was 4. Then Manwë asked, where was Olorin? Olorin, who had slipped in quietly and sat at the edge of things, as he always did, looked up. He said he was too weak for such a task. He said he was afraid of Sauron, the one who would stand alone on a bridge of black stone against an ancient fire demon, the one who would die and return and break the staff of the head of his own order, the one who would face the Lord of the Nazgul at the gates of a ruined city with no army behind him. That person said, in a Valinorian council chamber, that he was afraid. Manwë's reply carries the weight of inevitability, that this was all the more reason to send him. And then Varda, Queen of the Stars, she who lit the lights the first elves ever saw, looked up from whatever she was doing and said simply, not as the third. Olorin would not rank third among the 5. He would rank second. The text adds, quietly, and Saruman remembered it. Saruman, in white, named head of the order, already storing a resentment that would take 1,000 years to finish fermenting. Gandalf arrived. He chose gray. He chose a staff and a slightly battered hat and a fondness for pipeweed and the company of people everyone else considered too small to matter. This was not modest. It was strategic. Sauron thought in terms of power. He calculated threats by armies, rings, servants, visible rank. A wandering old man who told jokes at parties and spent an alarming amount of time in the gardens of small people in a small country called the Shire. This was not a piece on any board Sauron knew how to read. The invisibility was the design. For 2,000 years, Gandalf wandered. No tower, no city, no fixed abode. No formal seat of power. He went where the need was, and the need was everywhere. His method was almost never what anyone later remembered as heroism. It was mostly conversation. It was sitting in rooms and listening and saying the right thing to the right person at exactly the right moment, so that when he left, they felt more capable of their lives than they had before he arrived. In the year 2063, the shadow over Mirkwood thickened. Something called the Necromancer had gathered in the ruins of an old fortress, Dol Guldur, in the southern reaches of the Great Forest. The wise were cautious. The White Council, which Gandalf sat on but did not lead, Saruman led it as he had insisted, preferred to theorize from a safe distance. Gandalf went in. No council sanction. No backup. He walked into the fortress alone because he needed to know what was there, and sitting at a distance worrying about it was not his nature. He was Nienna's student. He looked at wounds directly. He found enough to be alarmed. Whatever was in the fortress retreated rather than face him. For nearly 4 centuries, the fortress lay quiet. The wise called it the watchful peace. Gandalf called it time being bought. He went back to his wandering. In the year 2850, Gandalf went back into Dol Guldur. Deeper this time. In the dungeons, in the dark and cold, he found a dwarf. The dwarf was dying. He had been there long enough that he barely remembered himself. One of the 7 dwarf rings had been taken from him. He was hollowed out, present in the world only by the thinnest remaining thread. His name was Thrain, son of Thror, father of Thorin Oakenshield. Gandalf could not save him. Too much had been taken. But in his last coherent moments, Thrain pressed something into the wizard's hand. A key and a map, not on paper but carried in what remained of his memory, spoken in fragments, drawn out later by Gandalf from the ruins of what Thrain could still tell him. The map of Erebor, the lonely mountain, the location of the back door that Smaug, for all his terrible cunning, had never found. Thrain could not fully remember at the end why these things mattered. He could not quite remember who he was, but he pressed them into the wizard's hand anyway, with the last of whatever urgency had kept him alive in that place. Then he died in the dark, in Sauron's dungeon, with no witness but a grey wizard who had arrived too late to save him and just in time to receive what he was carrying. Gandalf came out of Dol Guldur with 2 things he hadn't had before. He had confirmation. The necromancer was Sauron, diminished, but returning, gathering strength, beginning to rebuild, and he had a dead man's key. He would carry that key for 91 years before he used it. 91 years. That is the kind of patience that only a being of a particular nature can manage. Not hopeless patience, not resigned patience. The patient waiting of someone who knows the moment is not yet, and trusts, absolutely trusts, that when it comes, he will recognize it. Here is the thing that almost never gets said. Gandalf had no official mandate for most of what he did. He had a general commission: inspire the free people's work against Sauron, do it by persuasion rather than force. He had the ring of fire on his finger. And beyond that, he operated on intuition, intelligence, and 2,000 years of paying very close attention to everything around him. The White Council existed. Saruman led it. And Saruman was, by the time the Third Age deepened, increasingly useless as a source of sanction for anything Gandalf actually needed to do. Galadriel had wanted Gandalf to lead the council. She had seen, with the long sight of someone who had been alive since the First Age, that he was the greatest spirit among them. She had wanted him in the chair. He had refused. Not from false modesty, because the chair was the problem. A fixed position with a fixed location and a formal rank that Sauron could plan around was exactly the wrong shape for what he needed to do. He needed to be everywhere. He needed to be the piece on the board the enemy couldn't find because the enemy wasn't looking in the right places. So Saruman took the chair. And Saruman in the chair became the obstacle. When Gandalf wanted to press the council to act against the necromancer, to confront Dol Guldur, to force the question, Saruman argued for delay. The arguments were always reasonable. The information was incomplete. The risk of acting too soon outweighed the risk of watching and waiting. His voice had a quality of absolute reasonableness that made it very difficult to say where, exactly, the logic had failed. Gandalf sat in those councils and felt the particular suffering of being right in a way he could not yet fully prove, blocked by a colleague whose caution was indistinguishable, from the outside, from wisdom. So he acted without them, not in dramatic defiance. He didn't announce anything. He simply went where the need was and did what the need required and reported back when he had something to report. This pattern, the man who sees clearly what is needed, who cannot get institutional sanction in time, who acts on his own judgment and is vindicated and then ignored again, repeats itself through the entire Third Age. He wears it with such patience that it doesn't look like frustration. But it is. By the time Gandalf sat down in the prancing pony in the year 2941, he had been worrying about the dragon for a long time. Smaug was not simply a large lizard with a treasure fixation. He was, in Gandalf's strategic assessment, one of the most dangerous pieces on the board. Think about it. A dragon of Smaug's power, sitting on the immense wealth of Erebor, with access to the passes of the northern Misty Mountains and the ability to fly vast distances in a single night. What would happen if Sauron reached out to him? Rivendell was not far from Erebor's flight range. Lorien was not impossible. The Shire, so carefully hidden, so carefully kept off every map that mattered. A dragon on the wing could reach it in an afternoon. This was the calculation that sent Gandalf to find Thorin Oakenshield. He found him in Bree, brooding into a drink with the expression of someone who had been brooding for decades and was comfortable continuing indefinitely. A dwarf king without a kingdom. His people scattered, his father dead in Sauron's dungeon, his grandfather murdered by an orc, his entire inheritance currently keeping a dragon warm. He had pride and ability and a grievance so large and so legitimate that it had become the organizing principle of his personality. He produced the key. He produced the map. 91 years he had been carrying them for this conversation. Thorin recognized them immediately. Of course he did. They were his father's. The last thing Thrain had managed to send out of the dark before the dark took him. In Thorin's recognition, Gandalf saw the door open. The quest of Erebor was born in that room. There is a specific quality of morning in the Shire. A specific quality of light through old curtains onto floors worn smooth by generations of hobbit feet. The smell of baking and garden earth and a contentment so long established it has become indistinguishable from the landscape itself. Gandalf had been watching that specific quality of morning for decades before the morning he knocked on Bilbo Baggins' round green door. He had watched Bilbo's grandfather, the old Took, who lived to 130 and remained vigorous in ways Gandalf found quietly interesting. He had watched the Took family specifically, their persistent tendency to produce individuals who were slightly more than the average hobbit in ways the average hobbit found uncomfortable. And he had watched Bilbo himself, watched him grow from a child into a young hobbit into a middle-aged one, watched the respectable Baggins half win its daily victory over the adventurous Took half, watched him settle into Bag End with his books and his pantry and his pipe, and thought, there it is. 3 things, when you pull them apart, explain the choice. First, the Shire would matter. Gandalf believed, with the long-range strategic instinct of someone who had been watching the world for 2,000 years, that the Shire would be pulled into the great events of the age. Better to prepare a connection between hobbits and the wider world before that happened rather than after. Second, Bilbo had what the dwarves lacked. He was quick, light, quiet, observant, and possessed of a particular courage that didn't look like courage until the moment it was needed. The courage of someone who cares more about the thing at stake than about their own comfort. Gandalf saw this before Bilbo knew it was there. Third, and deepest, Bilbo was outside Sauron's calculations. Entirely outside them. Sauron had built his threat assessments around elves, men, dwarves, wizards. A hobbit was not on any list he had ever made. A hobbit slipping into a dragon's lair through a back door marked on a dead man's map was a piece on the board that the enemy simply could not see. Gandalf understood this principle so well that he would later apply it on a vastly larger scale. But on the morning he knocked at the green door, he was still working it out. He knocked. He said he was looking for someone to share in an adventure. Bilbo said they didn't want any adventures here. Thank you. Gandalf smiled, marked the door, and came back the next morning with 13 dwarves. The quest of Erebor succeeded. Everyone who needs to know the broad outline already does. Trolls, goblins, eagles, Mirkwood, a dragon who died, a mountain reclaimed, a battle of 5 armies won at great cost. Thorin died of his wounds with his kingdom barely in his hands, which is one of the saddest moments in the entire legendarium. And in that same year, the White Council finally attacked Dol Guldur and drove Sauron out. Gandalf had timed both events deliberately. The 2 blades of the same scissors, the dragon removed from the north, Sauron expelled from Mirkwood, cut in the same year. 2,000 years of patient work arriving at a single season of decisive movement. But something else happened, smaller and quieter, that Gandalf noticed and filed away. Bilbo came home. He came back richer, changed, somewhat more at ease in the world. He had, in the most literal sense, become a different person. And in his pocket was a small gold ring. He said he'd found it in a goblin cave. He used it, when pressed, to explain various implausible escapes. He called it his luck. Gandalf thought about the ring. He was busy, the world was busy, Sauron was moving back toward Mordor. There were urgent things demanding attention. The ring was a curiosity, a strangeness. Not yet the most urgent strangeness on the list. But he kept thinking about it. 60 years passed between the quest of Erebor and Bilbo's 111th birthday party. 60 years of Gandalf visiting the Shire. Coming back with fireworks and pipeweed. Sitting in Hobbit gardens watching things grow. Befriending Bilbo in the particular way you befriend someone when you are observing them closely for reasons you don't want to explain. He watched Bilbo age, which he expected. He watched Bilbo fail to age, which he did not expect. 60 years. And Bilbo, who had been 50 on the morning of the adventure, was still, essentially, Bilbo. Older in some ways. White-haired, a little slowed. But with a vitality that should not have been there. Eyes too bright. Mind too sharp. At 111 years old. Gandalf had been quietly not reassured for 60 years. And then the birthday party arrived. And he watched Bilbo's face in the moments before he put on the ring and vanished. He watched the struggle in the study to put it down. He heard my precious spoken in a voice that did not quite sound like Bilbo. He raised his own presence in the room then, not the old man's presence, but the Maya's, the ancient spirit underneath the gray cloak. And Bilbo, startled and briefly clear, put the ring in an envelope on the mantelpiece and walked out the door to Rivendell. Gandalf stood in the study for a long moment. Then he took it. He held it by the fire. He did not yet open it. He was thinking. He would be thinking in various places across the roads of Middle-earth and the archives of Minas Tirith for the next 17 years. He went south to Gondor, specifically to the great library of Minas Tirith, where records sat unread for centuries. Records of the last alliance. Isildur's own account of the day the war ended. The day he cut the ring from Sauron's hand and, standing there on the slopes of Mount Doom with the crack of doom in front of him, chose to keep it. What Gandalf found in that archive was a detail written in Isildur's own hand. When the ring was hot, letters appeared on it. Black speech. He couldn't read them, but they were there. Gandalf went home to the Shire. He sat with Frodo, Bilbo's nephew, now the heir of Bag End, who had grown up with Gandalf's occasional appearances the way you grow up with a particularly interesting weather phenomenon. He took the ring. He held it in the fire on the hearth. He held it there a moment. He pulled it out. Cool. Undamaged. Perfect. He turned it in his fingers. And on the surface of the gold, in letters of fire, the inscription appeared. He read it aloud in the black speech, the tongue of Mordor. The tongue he had known since before Mordor existed. One ring to rule them all. One ring to find them. One ring to bring them all and in the darkness bind them. When he read it aloud, even in that small room, in that quiet house, the fire seemed to dim. The shadows leaned closer. Frodo felt a fear he didn't have words for, only the sense that whatever Gandalf had just said had the weight of something that should not be spoken inside a hobbit hole in the Shire. Gandalf put the ring back in its envelope. It was Sauron's ring. The one ring. Isildur had taken it and kept it and lost it in the river, and it had lain in the mud for centuries until a creature named Smeagol found it on his birthday and killed his cousin for it on the riverbank, and then Smeagol, who became Gollum, had played a riddle game with a hobbit in the dark and lost it, and the ring had arranged its own finding by the hobbit it wanted to find it. 60 years in Bilbo's pocket. 17 years of Gandalf's quiet investigation. And now here, in a firelit parlor in the Shire, the thread had led somewhere that made everything that came before look small. Gollum was the other witness. Gollum had carried the ring for 500 years. And at some point in the years after losing it, Sauron's agents had found him and tortured him and learned 2 words from him. Shire. Baggins. Sauron knew where the ring had been. The Nazgul would ride as soon as he was ready. Before Gandalf could move the ring to safety, he needed Gollum found. He needed the full chain of possession confirmed from another source. And so he asked Aragorn. Aragorn, son of Arathorn, chieftain of the Dúnedain, heir of Isildur, the most important secret of the age, still going by the name Strider, still traveling roads other people avoided, still carrying the greatest lineage in Middle-earth in the body of a ranger who slept under hedges. He found Gollum, in the dead marshes, in the haunted country east of the Eamon Mule. He caught him, which must have required skills the text doesn't dwell on. He brought him alive to Thranduil's halls in Mirkwood, where the wood elves held him. What Gandalf and Aragorn extracted from Gollum, through patient interrogation of a shattered mind, was the complete chain. The ring in the river, 5 centuries underground, the riddle game, Bilbo, the Shire, Baggins. Confirmation. Then, in the year 3018, Gollum escaped. Shortly after, he fell back into Sauron's hands. By the time the Black Riders rode from Mordor, Sauron had confirmation. He was already moving, and Gandalf was locked in a tower. While Gandalf wandered, Saruman studied. He had dedicated himself to understanding the rings of power, their making, their history, their mechanics. He became, over centuries, the greatest scholar of Sauron's methods that the Third Age produced. He began as a strategist studying an enemy and became, slowly and without a clean moment of transition, something more like an admirer. This is important to understand. His fall does not look like a fall from the inside. He was not sitting in Isengard deciding to become a villain. He was studying the enemy, which any good general should do. He was understanding how the rings worked. He was recognizing that the principle underlying Sauron's entire project, that a sufficiently wise will, imposing order on a chaotic world, produces better outcomes than freedom, was not without intellectual appeal, especially if you were the wise will in question. The beginning of corruption is not envy. It is respect. Saruman came to respect Sauron's craftsmanship, came to see in the design of the One Ring a kind of genius that he, as Allah's student, was uniquely positioned to appreciate. And from respect to wanting the same thing is a very short step. He found the Palantir in Orthanc around the year 3000, one of the 7 seeing stones. He used it carefully at first, with the discipline of a scholar who understood such tools required caution. Then he looked east. The stone showed him Sauron. Or rather, Sauron showed himself through it. A stronger will can control what a weaker will seize through a Palantir. Not by lying, the stones don't lie, but by selecting. By showing truth in precisely the proportion and sequence that produces the conclusion you want drawn. Sauron showed Saruman his forces, his numbers, the certainty of what was coming, the inevitability of his return to full power. All of it true, all of it arranged to produce a single conclusion. Resistance is futile, and the wise will find a way to benefit from what is coming rather than be destroyed by it. Saruman believed he was learning about Sauron. He was being studied by Sauron. By the time Gandalf arrived at Isengard in the summer of 3018, Saruman had been Sauron's student for nearly 1,000 years without ever realizing he'd enrolled in the class. When Gandalf refused both of Saruman's proposals, cooperate with Sauron or take the ring themselves, and looked at Saruman's robes and saw that they were no longer white but woven in all colors, shifting, all-containing, he said, "I liked white better." Saruman's reply, "White serves as a beginning. White cloth may be dyed. The white page can be overwritten. The white light can be broken." Gandalf. He that breaks a thing to find out what it is has left the path of wisdom. This is not clever dialogue. It is the most precise possible diagnosis of the specific form Saruman's corruption had taken. He had broken the white light to find out what was inside it. And what he found was that all the other colors were there, and he concluded from this that white was merely one option among many, rather than the ground from which all the others came. Saruman imprisoned Gandalf on the pinnacle of Orthanc. 2 months, exposed to weather, interrogated, pressed with renewed offers and threats. He did not break, because what Sauron and Saruman had consistently gotten wrong about Gandalf was the assumption that he was holding out for a better deal. He wasn't ambitious. He didn't want the ring. He didn't want power in the sense they meant it. He wanted the world to be a place where hobbit gardens and elvish songs and the particular quality of morning in the Shire could exist without the shadow of the enemies will pressing down on them. No ring was going to give him that. A ring would take it away. He was rescued by an eagle. He called Shadowfax on the plains of Rohan. He rode north. He arrived to find Frodo already gone. This is the question that sits underneath the whole story and almost never gets asked directly. Why hobbits? Why did Gandalf, across 2,000 years of wandering with access to Elrond's counsel and Galadriel's foresight and the Rangers' networks and the deep lore of the dwarves, keep coming back to a quiet country of comfortable people who grew vegetables and smoked pipes and were, by every serious strategic reckoning, completely irrelevant. Because he saw something there that none of the serious strategic minds had seen. The wise, the elves, the senior figures of the White Council thought in the categories of power. They assessed threats and strengths and alliances and the movement of armies. When they discussed what could resist Sauron, they talked about elven rings, elvish strongholds, the remaining strength of Gondor, the scattered remnant of Arnor. These were the pieces on the board that mattered. These were the forces that could be counted. Gandalf had spent 2,000 years walking roads the powerful didn't walk, sitting at fires the powerful didn't sit at. And he had noticed something that the categories of power consistently missed. The world is not actually governed by power. It is governed by choices. And the choices that end up mattering most are almost never made by the people with the most power. They are made by ordinary people at the specific moments when ordinary people find themselves in extraordinary circumstances with no one else to make the choice for them. He had seen this pattern enough times across 2,000 years of watching mortal lives to trust it. He had seen small acts of mercy become the foundations of long peace. He had seen a single refusal to participate in cruelty change the trajectory of an entire city. He didn't just like hobbits. He bet the world on them. Because he knew that Sauron, who thought only in terms of power, would never see them coming. And he knew that if the ring was to be destroyed, it would have to be carried by someone who didn't want it, through a country where they weren't expected, to a place they weren't supposed to be able to reach. The invisibility of the Shire was the ultimate weapon. Gandalf's death in Moria was not a mistake. It was the final validation of everything he had been doing for 2,000 years. He stood on the bridge of Khazad-dûm against the Balrog, an ancient terror from the First Age, a being of the same order as himself but corrupted by the dark, and he did not move. He broke the bridge. He fell. He died. But before he fell, he had done the one thing that mattered. He had ensured the right people were in the right places. He had brought the fellowship together. He had set Frodo on the road. He had rekindled the hearts of the people who would have to finish the task. Gandalf chased the Balrog upward, up the endless stair, spiraling through living rock from the roots of the mountain to its very peak. They burst through onto the summit of Xaraxagil with the clouds below them and the sun fierce on the ice. They fought for 2 days and 2 nights with no witness. At the end, the Balrog was thrown down. It broke on the mountainside below. Gandalf stood alone on the peak. He felt the body fail. He died there, in the sun, on a mountain above the clouds, having just killed something that had not been killed since the First Age. Then something happened that sits outside the normal categories of Tolkien's world. He says of it only that Gandalf passed out of thought and time. He was sent back. By a power above the Vala, the logical inference is Eru himself, looking at what had been done and deciding the task was not finished. He came back white. The constraints of the Grey Commission dissolved. The limitations of the old assignment lifted. He could now act more fully as the being he actually was. He came back as what Saruman was supposed to have been. In the year 3021, a white ship left the Grey Havens on the evening tide. Círdan stood on the quay, as he had stood on quays since before the sun existed, watching it go. Aboard were Gandalf and Frodo and Bilbo and Elrond and Galadriel. And among the things Gandalf was wearing, the ring with the red stone, turned finally outward, toward Frodo's eyes, red as fire. Frodo understood for the first time that the Grey Wanderer had been a ring-bearer all along. The ship moved into the west and the grey water and the dimming light. The age of fire and shadow was over. The age of men was beginning. Men would have to make of it what they could, which was precisely what he had spent 2,000 years teaching them to do. The Shire still stood. Rivendell had given the world a king worth following. The hobbits who had gone out into the world had come back and proven that ordinary people with the right kind of courage could do things no wizard could have done in their place. The dragon was long dead. The white tree flowered in the courtyard of Minas Tirith. Not a perfect world. Frodo was broken in ways the Shire's green peace could not fully heal. His departure was a loss Sam would carry for the rest of his long life. The elves were leaving, taking with them the particular quality of enchantment they had brought to the world. But the fire Círdan had given him, the ring made by Celebrimbor without Sauron's hand in it, the ring whose gift was the rekindling of hearts in a world growing cold, that fire had done its work. It had moved through 2,000 years of darkness and found, in goblin caves and hobbit gardens and dwarven dungeons and elvish councils and on the bridge of a dead city, exactly the right hearts to kindle. Bilbo, who became brave. Frodo, who bore what could not be borne. Sam, who came home. Theoden, who rode out. Aragorn, who finally claimed what he had refused for decades. Faramir, who chose mercy over ambition. All those people, all those moments, all those choices made by ordinary people who had, somewhere along the way, been visited by an old man in a gray cloak who made them feel that the world was larger and more worth inhabiting than they had assumed. He did not make them choose courage. He never did. He put the vision in their hearts like the visions he had placed in the hearts of elves in Valinor, invisibly without a signature, and he let them choose. He walked unseen at their shoulders. Then he went home. The world he left behind was changed by the fact that he had been in it. And it would never entirely forget, even as it forgot the details, even as the Third Age became legend and the legend became myth and the myth became the almost remembered feeling that the world had once contained something larger than itself. It would never entirely forget the man in the gray cloak who knocked at doors and asked if anyone wanted to share in an adventure. That was the task. That was always the task. Not to defeat the dark himself. To light the fire and trust the people he loved to carry it. He did. They did. Based on the works of J.R.R. Tolkien, including The Lord of the Rings, The Silmarillion, and Unfinished Tales.